Hi there, welcome to part 3 of animal reproduction. Sorry about that. Today we are going to continue on in chapter 10 and cover things like gestation, the way the fetus attaches, parturition, different nutritional requirements, and reproductive issues that animals sometimes have. First off, though, you need a joke. What did the cow tell the calf? It's past your bedtime. In case you're curious, we're still studying in chapter 10 of scientific farm animal production. You will notice a couple of charts in here today that are extra helpful, and you may want to look those up in your book or take a few extra notes. We studied last week through kind of that process of ovulation and how all of that goes. The time that an animal is pregnant is called gestation, and that's where we'll start our focus today. Gestation starts at conception, and so scientifically this is where the sperm and the egg cells unite. They begin combining genetic material. The term gestation can be used clear until parturition, which is the scientific term for birth. When we're in the gestation period, every 20 hours, the embryonic cells duplicate their genes and divide. And so you start with two cells, the sperm and the egg, and then they combine and divide into 4, 8, 16 cells to create the new animal. In farm animals, it actually takes about 3 to 5 days for the fertilized egg to travel down the oviduct and into the uterus. The uterus is typically where the egg implants. Once it's in the uterus, there's this process that's called maternal recognition of pregnancy. Basically, the rest of the female's body recognizes that it's pregnant and allows the implantation of the egg into the endometrial lining of the uterus. And this is when we begin to see the placenta formed. Now, in gestation, we really divide it, when we're studying it, into two separate parts. The first is called implantation. The second is placentation. Implantation is much shorter. It's that period of time where the embryo implants itself into the endometrial lining. Now, the second part, placentation, is quite a bit longer, and this is the period of attachment between the embryo and the placenta. It's a really critical period, and so when we look at the production of animals, we typically try not to move the animals or cause undue stress during this time, or oftentimes the pregnancy won't be viable. For cows, that is about the first 20 or 30 days. You can see on the slide sows 14 to 21, and then the ewes and does are just under 15 days, and mares it's about 40 days. Development of the fetus starts right upon implantation, but it takes several weeks to fully connect with the embryo. We do see quite a few pregnancies that are problematic in there because if that embryo cannot attach, the placenta can't grow. Now, gestation length is an interesting thing to look at. It varies depending on the breed and the age of the animal. It also varies if the animal is a litter-bearing species or in animals that have multiples. If you look at the chart here, it not only tells you the gestation length, but the type of placentation. You can read more about that in your textbook if you want. But basically, these are different ways that the embryo attaches to the uterus, and they are definitely in line with how they are taxonomically divided in terms of animals. You can also see there's a column for how many offspring they usually have. Notice that oftentimes swine, we're looking at a whole different system because they have litters. Now the placenta is actually a temporary organ. It is the connection between the dam and the fetus, and it's very much so an exchange system. It's how the fetus gets nutrients and blood, and it's also how it gets rid of its waste products. Now, strangely enough, it's how the fetus gets its blood, but there is actually no mixing of fetal and maternal blood, and it can be very dangerous if there is. So the placenta serves a really important endocrine role as well, because that's how a lot of hormones can kind of travel around the body. In early pregnancy, the corpus luteum is responsible for producing progesterone that maintains the pregnancy, but in some species this is eventually taken over by the placenta, which keeps producing progesterone to signal to the rest of the female's body that they are indeed pregnant. So now we talk about the fetal membranes. The placenta is the interface between the dam and the fetus. On the dam side, you have the endometrial layer of the uterus. But on the fetus's side, you have what's called the chorion. The chorion encloses the fetus and all the other membranes that are with it. The function of the allantosis, is to collect liquid waste from the embryo, as well as gas exchanged used by the embryo. It fuses with the chorion and allows for circulatory exchange at the sites of attachment. If you look at this diagram of the placental membranes, you can see that one of the roles of the placenta is actually to protect the embryo. And so the embryo is kind of in the middle there, surrounded by all these different things, and including the inner layer and the chorion. And then we have the amniotic cavity, which is where the embryo or the fetus is. Two main parts of the fetal membranes. One of them is the amnion. This is the fetus, the sac, if you will, that surrounds the fetus. It's fluid-filled, and it serves as protection to the animal. Another important thing for you to understand is the umbilical cord. This is the link between the dam and the fetus in terms of blood. It has arteries and veins in it. It's how they exchange oxygen and nutrients and waste. Depending on the species, there are different ways that the placenta actually attaches within the animal. This is kind of a good diagram here. You can see that cats and dogs is quite a bit different than the method for humans and rodents, as well as the methods for cows, ewes, and does all together, and then horses and sows. Some animals, like humans, have a particular area where all the exchange happens. Others, like sows and mares, have diffuse attachment where the whole lining of the uterus interacts. And then there are lots of details to know about each of these placental types. If you are a producer with reproducing females on your place, you probably want to know and understand the placental type of your variety of animal so that you can diagnose some reproductive problems. For placental attachment, ruminants have a cotyledonary placenta. I should have practiced that word more before we did this lecture. Instead of having a large area of contact between the maternal and fetal vascular systems, these animals have between 75 and 125 structures called placentomes where the exchange of nutrients and waste take place. So they're kind of like polka dots, if you see in that diagram, and all of those attached to the female's body. Pregnant sheep, goats, and cattle have between 75 and 125. Deer also have this similar type of attachment, but they only have 4 to 6 of them, and they're quite a bit larger. The diffuse type of placental attachment is most common in sows and mares. It means that there's a uniform covering attaching the placenta. We do this with some villi on the fetal side, and on the maternal side they're endometrial cups. And so you can see that the little villi kind of fit into the cups, and that's how they attach. Now, the placenta plays a pretty large part in the endocrine system, but we talked about that doesn't always take over. It depends on the species. So in both ewes and mares, progesterone is produced by the placenta. And in sows and cows, for at least the first chunk of gestation, it's produced by the corpus luteum. On cows, interestingly enough, the placenta takes over it after 4 to 8 months. In late gestation, the endocrine system begins to produce estrogen, and that's important because it stimulates uterine contractions, which brings us to parturition, or the expulsion of the fetus and the placenta from the uterus. We call this the act of giving birth, calving, lambing, any of those things. There are really 3 stages of parturition. The first seems to take the longest because when we're watching animals, we're nervous for them at this point, but it involves cervical dilation and the entry of the fetus into the cervix, and then the expulsion of the fetus, and then afterwards the expulsion of the placenta. All of these are equally important. There's a lot going on with hormones in the birthing process. Progesterone levels go down because you don't need progesterone any longer to maintain the pregnancy. This is caused by this spike of prostaglandin. So the uterus, when it knows that it's time for expulsion, spikes the prostaglandin, and that causes progesterone to go way down. At this point, estrogen increases, and this causes an increase in oxytocin, which makes smooth muscles contract, and then relaxin, which opens up and relaxes the pelvis and the cervix. When all those things can happen at once, we have a pretty smooth birth. At least in the beginning of parturition, the offspring typically assume a position that gives them the least amount of resistance as they pass through the pelvic area into the birth canal. The most typical position for cattle, sheep, and goats is called the diving position, so the front feet and then the nose just behind it. Ranchers would say it was a normal presentation like you see at the top of the diagram. Now, pigs, ironically, don't orient themselves in the birthing process. They typically have significantly easier birth because of their size. It is important to remember that animals shift their position in the fetus a lot. And so we see animals that, maybe the calf is breech, and at the last minute the cow can shift it around, or the calf shifts around and has a normal presentation. There is quite a bit of link to genetics in terms of birthing ease, and it has a little bit to do with size, but it also has to do with some of the genetic traits that bulls will pass on. They've actually been able to sometimes find the correct trait and even make sure a bull has an influence on the cow for that offspring, so that it is born, or so that it creates young that are born in a better position for birthing. Calves can be born backwards, but it's not usually without assistance. This is one of the reasons we have to check animals quite a bit during calving or birthing time. Oftentimes they need that privacy, but you want to make sure that the offspring are in the correct position and can easily move out of the animal. When animals have twins, this is kind of what it looks like in a normal presentation. You can see that they are flip-flopped around just a little bit. the key point is to make sure that the correct head goes with the correct legs if you end up pulling calves or pulling goats or lambs, so that you don't harm the young. This is a pretty good video for you to watch. It was a farmer who filmed most of the birthing process, but I think there's a lot of different places you can find that video. If you haven't been around animals giving birth, I would recommend you at least watch it on video. Same thing with this video about pigs. Watching pigs give birth is significantly different than cattle, and so it's worth your viewing time as well. And then also the birthing process of a horse. While this one isn't a video, it does kind of to show you in pictures what the steps might look like, with the sac coming out first and then the animal presenting it, then making sure that the nose is clear, and then typically just about that time the mothering instinct kicks in and the mare will come lick off her baby. This is kind of an interesting thing. This is called a deciduous hoof capsule. There's a capsule that protects the mother's uterus and birth canal from the sharp edges of hooves during birth and pregnancy. And so what you see in this picture is that it's like a soft, squishy covering kind of over the hooves, and you can see that tissue that is kind of grown. Predators are really quickly attracted to the smell of the placenta. So for most species to survive, they've developed the biological ability to get their babies up quick and strong enough to run away from predators. The horse is no different. So the foal needs to have fully formed hooves at birth, but it needs to not tear the inside of the mare up on the way out. So truthfully, these little pieces of tissue wear off the foal's hoof, usually in its first few times walking, even on soft grass, because it just dries out really fast and comes off. But it's kind of cool to look at, and if you ever have the opportunity, it's definitely cool to see. Most people aren't around during the birthing process of horses, but it's a cool situation. Once the animal is born, we begin to note the importance of colostrum. Colostrum is the first milk that the female's body produces. It's very antibody rich, and it aids in the acquisition of passive immunity. So there are certain antibodies that can't cross across ruminant or equine placenta, and in that situation we need to get those antibodies in the animal as fast as possible. There is some very specific things in each type of colostrum. So best case scenario, the baby gets it from their mom. However, if there's problems with the birthing process or something that changes that situation, you can buy products that are colostrum, or some people occasionally freeze colostrum and reuse it, or keep some on hand from a different cow or something like that. Baby animals seem to get the most time when you look at Facebook posts or something like that. But oftentimes they aren't really telling the whole story of how hard it is to keep baby animals healthy and safe. The book that we're studying in doesn't talk a lot about nutritional requirements during gestation, but you can kind of infer some of that here. As we also talk about early lactation. So when the cow calves, for example, that would be top center. And so during early lactation, or that breeding period, it's pretty important that we have some high quality feed. We see then the cow go into mid-lactation and late lactation, and then have a dry period. Because we want a cow every year in terms of profit, that means that because we want a calf every year, that means that a cow is essentially pregnant 9 months of every year, and the nutritional requirements are pretty important. Now, not all of this goes off without a hitch, if you will. There are plenty of reproductive problems for animals. The first one we want to mention is heat stress. Anytime the body temperature goes over a certain amount, we see what's called heat stress. And in this diagram about a goat, you can see that that makes the fertilization levels go down, embryo quality go down. We see sometimes animals stop going in and out of estrus. They then may end up with respiratory problems or things like that. So keeping animals cool in the summer, warmish in the winter is very important. It's good to know about embryonic mortality. About 30% of all livestock pregnancies are not carried to term. About 90% of those losses actually occur really early in the pregnancy, in the first 3 weeks. And a lot of those are actually just the embryo not being able to latch on to the uterus and begin to form a healthy placenta. Some of the causes we see of that involve heat stress, bad nutrition, or sometimes infectious agents that are internal. Some things you can do to prevent embryonic mortality. One of them is to have a good environment for the animals to live in, clean areas. We want to manage the temperatures in terms of shade and protection from cold. Timing of insemination, be careful about vaccines and how those interact sometimes with insemination. We want to work on creating a somewhat stress-free environment in terms of when we're moving animals, when we're bringing them into groups, things that might cause that animal's body to not be able to focus on the uterus. Dystocia can be defined as difficulty birthing. And in dystocia, particularly in the cattle industry, we've really looked at a lot of things that cause it. The first is birth weight. Oftentimes the birth weight of the baby is too big. And so we want to keep the babies fully developed, plenty healthy. We want them to gain fast once they're born, but it's easier if their birth weight is a little lower. Some birthing difficulties come from malpresentation of the fetus. Others come from the mother's side of being able to dilate the cervix, or sometimes more serious problems such as a vaginal prolapse, a deformed fetus, not having a big enough pelvis size, poor nutrition, sometimes a breed difference, and sometimes the age of the dam. As a dam ages into those later years, sometimes dystocia increases. Here's some of the presentation problems we see in dystocia. They're fairly diverse. Sometimes they can kind of be fixed by the person helping the animal give birth. Sometimes they cannot. Now, in addition, we also see what are called perinatal losses. A peri means around and natal means birth, so these are kind of losses around the process of giving birth, and they include everything into the first 72 hours of life. We see about 10%, give or take, loss in cattle and sheep, and closer to 25% loss in in sheep and hogs. The 10% was cattle and horses. 80% of these losses are due to dystocia. So most of the time, if the animal survives birth well and is healthy, then they're in the clear, but we still do see a few problems. One of the biggest problems that producers want to look for is retained placenta. The placenta should follow the fetus out, and if it is not expelled within 24 hours of birth, it starts to cause some big problems. The reason this might happen is that the fetal membranes sometimes don't separate from the maternal membranes. If there was some dystocia problems, sometimes if it's twins, maybe there's a metabolic disease, sometimes those membranes just don't separate. About the only way you can prevent them is in good breeding and management, but particularly making sure the females are healthy when they give birth. Sometimes with a diffuse placentation, you can give animals an injection of oxytocin, and that will encourage them to naturally expel it. But with other problems with the placenta, there's nothing you can do. Definitely it's time to contact a veterinarian in this situation. Last category we want to talk about today is what's called neonatal losses. Neo means new and nate means born, so that tells you that we're looking at the losses we see in animals between 3 and 21 days. They are not near as common as the other losses and reproductive problems we've talked about. If they do happen, they're usually linked to either a disease outbreak or predators. Occasionally we see loss due to scours. Sometimes it has to do with the weather and interactions that way. But usually with enough monitoring of the environment, we can keep those animals protected from predators and also from the diseases that might harm them. Thanks for your time and attention today. We will see you again soon.